Hello again, everyone. So today we are going to get into part two, and talking of the Homefront series for World War One here, and talking about kind of the public and society and some more things that were going on at home. So early on, the war was pretty much like beloved. For instance, this is a huge parade actually in Australia, sending troops off, and you see all the people lining up, and there was like musicians and propaganda was really important for this as well, which you'll be using or seeing a separate video for that. But in general, everybody thought this was a good thing and it was great and we were going to win and our country's awesome. But as the war starts to drag on, there are more and more issues that develop, and people just are not happy. And as you hear horror stories and of what these soldiers were dealing with, and that it's not over, and how hard it is to live at home now, that some people are going to go after some things. And a great example, a couple big examples, like for instance, in 1916, 50,000 workers go on strike in Germany to protest the arrest of a socialist leader who was calling for an end to the war. Probably the biggest one was when the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Citizen Army, which are made up of Irishmen looking to gain freedom from Britain, especially after conscription laws went in. And so the Irish want freedom. They've been oppressed. It wasn't good. And they are going to rise up in Dublin. The English are going to move in and crush it. And if you see the picture on the bottom, you see all the rubble and a lot of the buildings that were destroyed in Dublin. The top is actually the men who were fighting it. A number of people were killed, actually many, many civilians. But this war was bringing back up a lot of the demons, if you will, and the anger that people had for a variety of different reasons. And people did begin to speak out against the war. First and foremost, you have some liberal groups, and many of them by 1916 and 17 are calling for peace. There's a women's peace march on the right there. And part of it as well is that they also start to act against land acquisition, because they feel that even if this war ends, if countries like seize land or something, that it's going to cause more problems. And boy, were they right. And actually, even in Britain, 200,000 workers go on strike because of lack of food and kind of the pointlessness of the war. So you get more and more people speaking out. And in some cases, there were the soldiers. We've talked about the horrors of the war. You've watched a variety of videos. In 1916, 1917, a variety of mutinies happened. They happened in Russia, France, and Italy were some of the biggest ones. In 1917, about half of French troops mutinied, and they actually executed 50 men, and that's what kind of put it to an end. But this gives you an idea that this war was just shattering Europe beyond belief. And then you also had ethnic groups that would rise up. Some of the biggest ones were the Czechs in Austria-Hungary will rise up and actually call for their own state. And the Arabs in the Ottoman Empire will actually lead armed revolt. There's a picture of some Arabs leading the way against the Ottoman Turks. So you have different ethnic groups that are tearing these nations apart and looking for freedom and looking for opportunity. So what started off as a rah-rah type of war thing deteriorated very, very quickly. And so the government will react in a variety of different ways. The autocratic governments, like in Russia and the Ottoman Empire and Austria-Hungary, I mean, they're just dropping hammers. Okay, they're throwing people in jail. Britain actually passes the Defense Against the Realm Act, which public authorities were actually allowed to arrest dissenters as traitors, and that's a really, really big deal. Later, it allows public officials to censor newspapers by deleting what they referred to as quote-unquote, as I'm air quoting here, objectionable material, which basically was anything that the state didn't want to see. And they also had the ability to suspend newspaper production. In France, early on, they were fairly lenient, but when Clemenceau came into power, basically all civil liberties were suppressed. There's actually one editor of a newspaper who was executed for sedition. So, a lot of times you can have nations that have civil liberties and stuff like that, but when war comes, a lot of times they just go away. Of course, the use of propaganda is going to be huge. We're going to watch a separate video for that, but that's going to be a big idea of using propaganda to keep people kind of in the fold. So let's look at some economic impacts that we're going to see both during and after the war. Well, really more or less after the war that we get on the home front as a result. And some general things, unemployment would generally go down. There would be more jobs available, and a lot of times that would hold after the war as well. And a lot of the big success came with trade unions. Trade unions got more and more members, and they got more and more rights because they were vital into keeping up production. And so basically what it was is this give and take, is that trade unions did their best to prevent strikes and actually work with both the factory owners and the government to keep wages, I guess, in check during the war. But then after the war, they can go back up wages-wise. They'll get collective bargaining rights. And as a result, membership will really, really grow as a result. So overall, you're going to see some really solid moves for trade unions or labor unions at this time. Now, after the war, though, there was definitely some issues, and I'm going to be talking about this as we move on to our next chapter and our next work, but inflation is going to be brutal. After the war, so many goods were in short supply. You're going to see the devaluing of currencies, which that picture will be on the right. You're like, what's with a bunch of kids? Trust me, I'll get there. The problem is because there was such a shortage of these goods and there was exhaustion after the war. I mean, the United States will help a lot with this, but goods, especially for like food and other basic necessities, will just go through the roof. And because of a variety of different reasons, there are certain nations in which their currencies would basically bottom out. For instance, in Germany, it was the worst, okay? It started in 1919. It reached rock bottom in 1923. You got to the point where German money was literally not worth the paper that it was printed on. If you were an American and you went to Germany in 1923, for $1 you would get 4 billion German marks. That's billion with a B. And on the right there, you think those kids are playing with blocks. They're not. They're playing with bound stacks of money and building a pyramid out of it because the money was that worthless. And what this inflation also showed were some of the class issues that were still around. So once again, the aristocracy and the labor owners and factory owners and those plutocrats were able to handle inflation more, whereas the middle and lower classes were getting slammed, and they really struggled for many years. And this is going to be a continuing issue that will go on after the war, which will have some big-time impacts on like the growth of communism and speaking against capitalism and stuff like that. So it's going to be a major thing that develops due to both inflation, which just exposes class issues even more. And the last thing I'm going to talk about at home was the impact for women, okay? And there were some massive changes in the workplace for women. Many women are going to take over jobs for men because of labor shortage, and women stepped up and they did wonderful things. And as you can see here on the right, they got into heavy industry and things along that line, but they also got into newer jobs like banking and other commerce type jobs like owning and running businesses, and then things like being chimney sweeps or truck drivers, and the factory workers, okay? You see women on the bottom making, putting together things for bullets. On the top right, those are explosive shells. 684,000 women in France actually work in the factories there. It's remarkable. In the Krupp armament plant, which was the largest armament plant in all of Germany, 38% of the workers there were women. And so these women were doing incredible things, and in many cases, they will actually, get increased wages. But then there's a good and bad after the war. The bad news is that after the war, many women were removed from these jobs. Many saw their wages go down, but they got that experience. And the women's movement and the suffrage movement that I've talked about before had really been going on and would get even more steam. And these women who had these opportunities for jobs are going to get back to them. And many will still find ways to live in their own and determine their own lives without being told what to do, if you will, by men. But the biggest thing that came out of this was suffrage. Okay, in Britain, Germany, Austria, and the United States, women will gain the right to vote in all of those countries. In Britain, it was only women over 30 in 1918, but then by 1928, it will be all women. But this is a momentous occasion. This allows women greater opportunities to be involved in the political process. Many women will actually serve as representatives in these nations, which is going to be crucial. You see there on the left a British woman putting in her first ballot, and on the right there are some American women that or women in the United States putting their ballots in for particular elections. And so we're starting to see some movement there. We're starting to see increased equal rights and stuff like that. And so I guess you could say there were some positive things that came out of the war, but the society was changing, and I'm going to talk about that a lot in my interwar videos in between, World War I and World War II, and we're going to see the changes that happened there as well, okay? All right, so make sure, hopefully this helps, gives you even more of a sense of what's going on at the war at this time. So I will talk to you all soon.